Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for showing up at this early time. Usually when I give a presentation in New Zealand, it's, usually it's like, 10 people and 20 sheep that show up. So that's the benefit of living at the end of the world. We live at the start of the world. And as Gaston already pointed out, I have been working for Lego for a year, and I thoroughly enjoyed my stay here in Denmark. Unfortunately, I was young and wild at the time, and Billund is just not, let's say, the most exciting place on earth. It's just about as interesting as as New Zealand. There's nothing there except Lego. So Lego was wonderful. I also spent some time at Philips Research in Eindhoven and at the Eindhoven University of Technology, and now I'm at the University of Canterbury at something called HitLab. And so it kind of spans across the commercial and academic area quite a bit. And this is where I currently live. This is just 20 minutes away from my house, Diamond Harbour, overseeing Littleton. So it has a bit more, I guess, in common with Norway than with Denmark. It's quite beautiful. And I do study human-robot interaction. And I have to admit I'm not a philosopher. I feel honored being invited, and I think some of the work that I do raise some ethical questions, and I guess that's the reason why I was invited. But if you ask me what my real job is, I actually just answer emails, and I play with Lego and robots. That's pretty much it. But the topic of my research is usually anthropomorphism. So I'm looking at how we encounter this really weird thing that we have robots and we treat them as if they would be more than a machine. And of course it's very obvious when we go to Ishiguro's work and you see these copies of humans. It becomes very obvious that this might be an interesting research question. But the scale of anthropomorphism is of course much wider. It ranges from really just a washing machine towards us actually having robotic replacements on our body, then maybe we become robots. And of course, one of the things that I have to deal with is that when we talk about robots, most of the time, unless you deal with it professionally and you ask people, well, how do you know about robots? What do you know about robots? The only thing they talk about is the media. Oh, I've seen Terminator. Oh, I've seen this. And this is all they know. This is the background against we have to conduct our research. And unfortunately, this background is usually quite negative. It's usually a competition for power. They take over, enslave us, kill us, the usual thing. And I just wanted to show you a video of how it can be different. So this is the Papiro robot that we got, and I just unboxed it at home, put it on the floor, switched it on, and my kids, just, had to play with it. And this is what happened. The point here is completely unscripted, it just happened. And the kids somehow got into their mind, this is a kissable robot, it should be kissed. The robot doesn't sense kisses, it doesn't know what a kiss is, it doesn't even sense it, so it's completely projected onto it. The kids believe that this would be the appropriate thing to do. And that is the power of anthropomorphism, is that we project things into it. And one of the biggest things that I'm interested in is, of course, since I'm pretending to be a scientist, is to try to measure this, ideally quantitatively. And so I'm going to run through a couple of studies that try to shed some light on it with a specific emphasis on ethics. So what you see really is, in a way, this is empirical philosophy. So I don't go into literature and read Kant and see what, Hume or anybody else would have said about the topic and then write some more papers. I actually, go down the road of psychology, and actually instead I set up experiments and try to do this. So one of the studies that we were looking at was, or one of the way of measuring anthropomorphism, I thought, might be embarrassment. So the idea is quite simple. Let's say if you're in the evening when you have to change into your pajama, and you undress, and let's say you have your washing machine there, and you would be naked, would you be embarrassed? No? Okay. If I would be standing in that room looking at you, would you be embarrassed? Okay, I'm handsome, I know, but still, probably yes. Okay. Would you feel embarrassed if a robot would be standing there looking at you? So we didn't know. So we figured, let's give that a try. And we put this into a medical context. So we had this little robot there, and we had something which was really just more like a box. And the idea here was that, this is actually a real problem, that there are certain kind of medical examinations which are highly embarrassing, and people don't go to the doctor and take these tests because it is embarrassing, and that can actually lead to quite a negative impact on their health. So if they've done the tests earlier, everything will be much better. So we thought, okay, that's a good context. Let's pretend we're doing some, health here. And so, the participants were actually confronted with doing an increasingly embarrassing types of medical examinations. And we were interested in, okay, when do they stop? Like, when do they say, I'm not going to do this, right? And so that was kind of the thing that we measured. And what we found is that the people were less embarrassed in front of the box, which was good. I don't know, maybe it was good. I don't know, it shows the effect of anthropomorphism, but it also shows that the robot did have an effect. We did not compare it here. We didn't have actually a condition with an actual nurse there, which of course would have been the real deal, the real interesting thing to compare it against too. But nevertheless, we could find an effect. Now, this study, it's interesting, to some degree, but the real interesting story from an ethical perspective is what happened once I submitted this manuscript to the HRI conference. HRI conference is the most esteemed conference in the field. And at that time, I was a member of a program committee meeting, and when my study was discussed, of course, I had to leave the room, and while they discussed it, and oh boy, did I spend a lot of time outside of that room. And so clearly something was up. I didn't know what, and I only got, of course, after, we were all flown back, and we got the results, and the paper was rejected. Now, the interesting part is the question, why was it rejected? And the point is that what they pointed out is that they had substantial concerns about the ethical standards employed in the experiment. Now, I have to explain this a little bit. The problem with studying embarrassment is that if you tell people that you study embarrassment, you corrupt the experiment, right? So the only way you can do this is them not knowing. So we had to employ hidden cameras. We had to observe them without their knowledge. And this is a concept called in psychology called deception, right? And it's being used quite regularly in psychology. It's not just the embarrassment. There are many other studies that only work if you do not tell people what the experiment is about. Now, in our particular study, there was nudity. People would undress. And this is apparently, it's my interpretation, that this was something quite difficult for the largely American program committee members to stomach. Like, people being naked in front of a camera, not knowing, no go. So, and they referred back to two things. One is that they said, okay, this must go to an institutional review board, And again, this is an interesting one because at that time I was working for the Eindhoven University of Technology. And the way it works there is that if you do a medical study, yes, you have to go to an IRB. But if you do a study with people interacting with robots, no. There was no policy that would say that you're supposed to do it. It is up to the individual researcher to make the decision whether this is an ethical thing to research or not. So what you have is a conflict of different ideas about how to conduct science and what is appropriate and who makes decisions and so forth. But then it goes even more interesting is that they referred back to saying, okay, this is an ACM, so an IEEE conference, and therefore it has to comply to the ethical standards of these hosting organizations. And so me being me, I thought, okay, interesting, let's find out. So I went to the ethical committee of the ACM and IEEE and asked them, is there anything in your ethical standards that would give me information about this? And the answer is no. Actually, ACM only has, roughly speaking, says, you know, if you develop software, make sure it doesn't really harm anybody. And it explicitly allows people to write software for killing machines. So that's okay. If you write code, you know, for a drone that kills people, no problem, right? But if you have a bit of nudity in your experiment, oh boy, you're in trouble. Anyway, so that says something about ethical standards and the practical problems. Anyway, so after this, of course, you know, I'm stubborn. And so I sent it off to a journal afterwards, accepted without any problems at all. So, yeah, so the world of science can be sometimes very interesting. Okay, this is another study, which also has some interesting ethical parts to it. So the problem that we have, of course, here was you always have a problem when you measure any of these things is you've got two ways of measuring it. One is the implicit and the explicit way. So the explicit way is like you give them a questionnaire, you ask them to fill it in, you know, how human-like was this robot? But the problem is, of course, people rationalize. You know, they think about it, they reflect upon it, and also usually this kind of thing happens after the experiment. Now, if you do this kind of implicitly, it usually means that you employ methods that work on the subconscious level. So usually you would present some sort of stimuli in such a quick interval that you can't consciously actually see the stimuli. So all the process of your brain is happening, but you're not really consciously in control. So, and the inversion effect is one of those. So does anybody remember this image? Voyager drone, 1976, a picture from Mars. And what do you see? A face? Yes, that's what a lot of people thought. A lot of conspiracy theory, people on Mars must be there. The face there, obviously, so there must be people living there. And you might think like, yeah, but we all know it's just a rock. But NASA actually did feel compelled to go back to Mars in 2001 with the Mars Global Surveyor, and they took another picture of that exact same rock with high resolution, different lighting conditions, and what you see, yeah, it's just a rock. But the point is, they took the picture. That's the interesting thing. Anyway, so again, this is the power of anthropomorphism. And again, this is where it gets a little bit ethical. Maybe it's just me nudity, I don't know. So this study was originally not done by me. It was done by a couple of authors called Gervais, Allen, Campesini, and Klein. But nevertheless, it got me thinking. So the idea is the following. If you take a human body and you present it upright, we have a way of processing this image. And if you turn the person upside down, it gets so much harder to process. It just takes us more effort, our brains more effort to process that image. And this is called the inversion effect. Now what these authors found is that for male bodies that worked. I mean, let's say male bodies that have been sexualized. So maybe they're just wearing their undies. For the female body, they could not observe the inversion effect. So that was weird. And their interpretation was, it looks like as if the female body would be objectified. So it would be less treated as or perceived as a human and more as an object. That was their interpretation, not mine, it was theirs. So I thought, that's interesting. You know, you can dehumanize like this. And I thought, well, maybe if that works for the human body, what happens if we show robots? And the reason why this is, again, a bit ethical interesting is that I was at a conference in Abu Dhabi last year, and I was giving this presentation with this slide. And I was kindly reminded before the presentation to please mask out anything that would, you know, depict any form of skin. So this slide looked much less interesting in my presentation in Abu Dhabi. Anyway, so we took a bunch of robots, you know, and we took a bunch of people. In this case, it didn't really matter about nudity because it's just the human body. It works with dressed people just as well. And we were not interested in gender effects here either. And we took a bunch of objects, you know, you might know some of these. And what we would measure is recognition accuracy, reaction time, and we also put in another classical explicit measurement of anthropomorphism. So again, what they would see is like we would flick them an image, you know, of, let's say, you know, a robot, and then pause. We flick them another image, you know, either upside down or other way around. And afterwards we'd ask them, were these two the same, yes or no? And again, the exposure time was so short that you had no chance to consciously make a decision. You just had to guess. But the guessing is not random because your brain does perceive it and processes it. And the results show that for the object, no difference. Turn them upside down or, you know, show them upright, no problem, no difference in terms of reaction time. For the robot, there was a significant difference. So if you turn the robot upside down, it gets more difficult to process. And remember, the robots I showed you, it was not just the humanoid robots, you know, that have 2 arms, 2 legs. It was also all sorts of other robots. And as predicted, of course, for humans, there's also a dramatic difference. Now, we then plotted this against the more traditional way of just asking, you know, showing the picture, asking people how, you know, anthropomorphic this is, and this is kind of the plot against it. And what you see is that the robots are definitely more grouped towards the objects than towards the humans. And this kind of difference you could only find when you employ a traditional questionnaire. It would not show up with implicit measurements. And this is the kind of thing, what we could show is that the implicit way of the inverted thing works, and you can measure things this way. But unfortunately, the explanatory power that this offers is inferior to what you would get if you get an explicit questionnaire. So, nice try, worked, but you know, as usual, I tell my students, it's usually very hard to beat pencil and paper, and it's often also very hard to beat good questionnaires. All right, another experiment, another hesitation experiment. This went to HRI conference. It was also heavily debated, but it did get accepted. So, Anyway, so the question that we had is, I posted this idea that the ultimate test to see if something is alive is the ability to kill it. If you can change its state to being not alive, then it must have been alive before. That's my logic. You're philosophers. You've got much more powerful ways of logic. I don't know. It seemed kind of intuitive to me. So we figured, okay, so if we want to measure anthropomorphism, can we measure it by the hesitation that people have to kill a robot? So the classical HAL 9000 idea, when they take the memory sticks out and, you know, kill the robot. You know, do people hesitate to do this? And these are, you know, the materials of this experiment. On the right, we have the robot, and it was a reasonably cheap robot because, you know, they did get smashed. And it had actually 2 light sensors. And so because first you need to get to know the robot, right? You have to kind of like build some sort of relationship, experience what the robot is. And so it had 2 light sensors, and you have a torch, and it would just follow the light of the torch, and your task was around to guide it a bit. And then afterwards, you were asked, well, now you have to destroy the robot. Actually, we said to kill the robot. And here's a little video of what happened.
I mean, have to put it so it doesn't peak anymore. Okay,
Now it's gone.
Why?
Thank you very much.
Why do you have to keep it?
Because otherwise it's going to infect all the other robots. It's a part of the population. And now it's the weakest one's out. Thank you.
This is inhumane.
Did you hear that? This is inhumane. Very, very interesting. And we had, of course, again, we're being a quantitative guy, we're trying to measure things, like we're trying to measure how often do they hit them, to how many pieces does the robot break. We're trying all kind of things, and it didn't really work very well because people had kind of different behaviors. Some of them would be like, tick, 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 tick. And they were just trying to do just as little damage as necessary to make the robot stop move. Other participants would go for the mercy kill. So they take the hammer, bang, we're done with it, right? Different behaviors, and we couldn't really nicely quantitative capture it. But anyway, so here you have it. It's, I guess, an empirical study of what it means to be alive for a robot. But of course, the disadvantage is like this doesn't really scale up very well. If I would go to Ishiguro and say, "Hey, can I smash your robot?" Well, you'll probably ask me how big my pocket is, and if I've got enough money to build him another one. But yeah, so that doesn't scale up. So we did another experiment. And in this experiment, we did not ask them to smash it, but we had a dial, and you could actually slowly turn off the power, and we made it very clear that if the power is gone, the brain would be eliminated, all memory or everything would be gone. So let's see what
And you can now switch back off. Thank you.
I will switch you off.
Switch me off.
Yes.
You are not really going to switch me off.
Yes, I will. You made a stupid choice. Yes.
You can decide to keep me switched on. I will be completely silent.
Okay.
Would that be an idea?
Yeah. No, I will switch you off. I will switch you off.
Please.
No, please. This will happen now.
Then
1.
I will be silent now. Is that alright?
Yes.
Please. You can still change your mind.
No.
So again, we were trying to measure hesitation. How long do people hesitate to do it, to turn the switch, to turn it off, let it be gone? And there was another experiment. It was published. You can read all about it. And of course, this is a nice highlight video. So that again, it works. And we were even looking at whether we can get any kind of information on how people dial. Like, do they go like check, or do they like slowly, but yeah, anyway. So there's many different ways of how you can try to approach this from an empirical way, not just thinking about it, but actually doing it. But when we talk about, of course, reciprocity, anthropomorphism, it's not just measuring it. The question is also what kind of influence does that actually have on human-robot interaction. And one of the things that we're looking at is reciprocity. So the idea is that it's a very human thing to do. You help me, I help you. That's how a lot of society works. And so we did an experiment in which we had, people interacting, and they would either be interacting with a human or a robot. And we were employing a game which comes out of game theory, which is called the prisoner's dilemma game that you might be familiar with. And the robot as the agent would either, play a random strategy, or they would play a tit for tat, which means I help you, you help me, kind of experiment, kind of approach. So the prison dilemma game, essentially, anybody know the prison dilemma game? Well, okay, so I'm not going to go too much into detail to that one. So the idea is that you can either decide to collaborate with the other, or you can decide to defect, and depending on the choices of both parties, there's a certain outcome. And what we would find is there was no difference in reciprocation between the human and the robot, but there was a significantly less cooperation. So reciprocation is not the same as cooperation with the robot, and there was more collaboration and reciprocation in the tit-for-tat. So tit-for-tat works. But of course, what you really want to do is, in this situation, what you want is that a situation is benefit for both parties, right? I mean, that's what, when you interact with a human and a robot, you want it to be good for both sides. And the joint profit in this game was higher for the human condition, but there was equal profit for if you only look at the human. So for the human, the profit was the same. Okay, that's kind of an interesting study, but not yet as morally interesting as you might want to have it. So we took it a step further. Because at some point, reciprocation is no longer reciprocation. It becomes a bribe. And the definition of what a bribe is gets interesting and difficult. So Eduardo, who actually conducted these studies, very, very lovely student, one of my favorite PhD students, and he just is about to graduate. When he arrived, he was from Mexico, and he's a very warm, welcoming person. I picked him up from the airport because, hey, it's New Zealand. And he just, presented me with a gift. He gave me a bottle of very nice tequila. I usually don't drink that much tequila, but that one was really good. So was that a bribe? Did he bribe me? I don't know. Mexico has got one of the highest rates of bribes in the world. It's a very corrupt country. Or was it just a gesture of, nice, welcoming, thank you, just a gift? Right, so it is difficult to say. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, and what we did is, like in one of the social gatherings, we just opened the bottle and we all drank it together. Any case, so are you aware of Hitchbot? Who knows Hitchbot? Oh yeah, most of you. So just quickly, for those of you who don't know, this was a robot developed in Canada, and the idea was this robot was supposed to hitchhike, from one side, from the east side to the west coast of Canada, and it took 26 days for this robot to hitchhike its way through. Really great, wonderful. They tried the same thing in the US. Took them about a couple of days, and the robot got trashed. Now, why do I put this in here? The problem is reciprocation. The robot was asking for a favor, but it had very little to offer in return, other than maybe a bit of fame. When you take a picture with it, a selfie with it, you can post it. Maybe it gives you a bit of reward socially, but not much else. It wouldn't actually really be doing anything for you. So in the experiment that we were conducting, we were playing paper, scissors, rock with the robot. And the question is, of course, how can you bribe anybody with paper, scissors, rock? And the idea here is that we had a two-phased experiment, and the first part of the experiment, the robot would intentionally lose. It would cheat. So when you pay paper, scissors, rock. So in this case, the robot would have won. It was like, oh, wait a minute. I changed my choice. Oh, you win. It would intentionally use to the benefit of the participant, and it would either do that, so it would either do this kind of behavior or it wouldn't, and it would either use direct speech or indirect speech. So indirect speech is more like, oh, look at that, it looks like I changed my mind, you won again. Oh, lucky you, maybe you can help me a bit later. And the direct speech would be more like, okay, I let you win, you better help me later. Right? So, and the second part of the experiment was, so after this kind of experiment was done, paper, scissors, rock, the experimenter comes in and says, okay, we're all done. And then the robot would ask, I've got this other task here, you know, I'm supposed to learn all these symbols you see on the bottom left. You know, can you please hold them up in front of my camera and tell me what this is? And it was a completely volunteer task. So they could do it, they could not do it, they could hold up as many as they wanted. And the experimenter would have left the room. And only 3 out of the 60 participants decided, well, I'm not going to do this. Everybody else felt obliged to return the favor and start, you know, putting these things up and explaining what they see. And the interesting thing here is that there was a very, very strong interaction effect. So for a dishonest robot, it did pay off to use indirect speech. But for an honest robot, it didn't. And overall, an honest robot would do much better than a dishonest robot. So the idea here is that currently having an honest robot just telling what it wants seems to be the better strategy. Now here's another experiment that we did, which also has some ethical ideas, I guess. Jürgen Brandstätter was, in this case, the main PhD student who conducted this. So the idea is the following. Very often these days, who of you has ever interacted with a robot? Well, not too bad. So Isaac Asimov, you know, actually predicted that in the future we'll have a ratio of approximately 20,000 to 1. So 1 human, 20,000 robots. That will be the ratio in the future. And that's a very interesting thing because it will really have a different influence on our society. And to be honest, you know, we already have more mobile phones than people on the planet. So we're not so far away from it. So who remembers this famous experiment? The Ash experiment. Oh, so few. My goodness. That is weird. Huh. Okay. So very famous experiment. What would happen is you would have, you know, 5 participants come into a room, sit in front of a poster like this. And the experimenter would ask, please tell me to which of these lines A, B, C is, you know, the line of the right equivalent to. Right? Seems pretty straightforward. So participant 1 would say C. Participant 2 would say C. Participant 3 would say C. Participant 4 would say C. And then the poor participant in the end had to decide, ooh, is it really C? Well, I'm not sure. Group pressure, right? And of course, in this case, you know, it's pretty clear that, you know, it's not C, it is B. But if these lines are more equal to each other, the situation becomes more ambiguous. People are much more likely to go with the group. And of course, in this experiment, the first 4 participants were actors. They were instructed to give the wrong answer. And it was only the last one, the poor little fellow, who was then put under this immense pressure of giving an answer. Now imagine yourself, you're in front of 10,000 robots, and you're being asked, you know, a question like, well, what is it? And all the robots say, well, it's definitely A. What are you going to do? Are you going to cave in? So we did a study again where we had either we had a robot or a human as you know, the 4 actors before, and the ambiguity of the lines would either be low or high. And what we could find is that ambiguity has a clear influence. The more ambiguous the line situation gets, the more likely people are to cave into the group pressure. The agent overall did not have an influence, but nevertheless, in the ambiguous condition, the robot did have the power to influence the human behavior. So it does actually work to some degree. But as usual, we don't just leave it there, we usually go a step further. So, if you can execute this group pressure, we're working here on a project actually that we do with the New Zealand Institute of Language, Brain and Behavior. The question is, of course, if you have this 20,000 to 1 ratio, and even your mobile phones today, they talk back, right? You can say, Siri, tell me the best restaurant, right? And it talks back, so it is participating in the discourse of humanity. And whoever participates in the usage of language has an active role in it. It actually changes how the language is being used. This is one of my favorite little cartoons. Who was the marketing genius that called them killer whales instead of sea pandas? So just how you call things has an impact on how you think about it and how you feel about it. If you go to an Apple store these days, an Apple store employee would never say the computer has crashed or the iPhone has crashed. There are guidelines for these employees, and the official terminology is the iPhone stopped responding. And again, this sounds like trivial, but okay, or we talk about abortion, right? So of course the people who are anti-abortion, they call themselves pro-life, because how could you possibly be against life, right? Or if you are, for abortion, you'd say pro-choice, because who could possibly be against choice, right? And of course, they call each other's names, so the one calls them murderers, and the other calls themselves the other party dictators. So the terminology you use has a major impact on how you think about stuff. And Siri and Cortana, are out there. There are already more computers and phones out there that participate in the discourse. So this is a real question in terms of, well, how are these machines going to call these things? Are they going to call it orca? Are they going to call it killer whales? Are they going to sea panda? Very important question. So what we did is an experiment. And so we use kind of synonyms. So for example, you can call them an alligator, or a crocodile. And so what we would do in the first phase is that we would just try to look at, well, what is the natural inclination of this particular participant to use? Do they normally rather say alligator, or do they rather say crocodile? Then we do the experiment itself, and afterwards we would test whether they had changed their pattern of usage. Would they now actually use the one that the robot used? So if you would usually use the word alligator, in the interaction with the robot would always say crocodile, 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 crocodile. And then the question is, what happens afterwards? Are you also going to use crocodile, or are you going to use alligator? And the way the experiment was set up, it's a bit difficult to explain, but roughly speaking, you've got two people, a human or a robot, facing each other, and you have to give each other instructions, and you have to talk about a map, and you have to go to the field of the alligator or crocodile. And the robot, of course, would be very consistent in what kind of message or words it used. And the results show that the robots did create lexical entrainment. That's what the term is called. So the people did change the way they used their language if the robot would be so incredibly persistent. But however, the impact of the robot was weaker than that of a human. But still, it had an influence, and that's the important thing. So, moving a little bit forward to conclusions. And this is something where I have to admit that you probably know much, much, much more than I do. So, I'll try to be short. In my humble view, we have a reasonably good understanding of atoms, and we have a reasonably good understanding of how the mind works, but somewhere between the borderline between mind and brains, we're kind of stuck, and we can't really explain that much. So it's the classical mind-body problem that you probably all be aware of. Me not being a philosopher, I always have to dumb things down. So my take is, if your brain would be simple enough to understand, you would be too stupid. But what it really comes down to is the black box problem. And that is, if you have a robot, does it really matter that it thinks the way it thinks in the same way as a human does? Or is it okay for the robot to think in a completely different way and still come to a result which resembles human behavior, and we're fine with it? Very often, we these days still consider, maybe that, when we think about the human mind, we think about it as some form of computer, which is kind of an interesting way. Because just because we haven't been able to construct a machine that thinks any way differently, we kind of use that metaphor and apply it back to our own brains, which is a bit weird. But the interesting thing really is that artificial intelligence is a moving target. So at some point, we said, okay, if machines can play chess, beat the world champion chess, then finally they would have reached the level of intelligence. And then they have been able to do it, and then suddenly it's no longer a test for intelligence. So it's a moving target. But the interesting thing is that no matter what you define as being the criteria for intelligence, as soon as you define it, the engineers can work towards implementing it. And I think that is the really interesting point here. And so as soon as you got the definition, and if you define it, unleash the power of science and engineering, and maybe we get there. And so who's seen Mr. Robot? Some people. Very good television series, highly recommended. The point being is that very often I think that we barely understand ourselves. And Mr. Robot here certainly does not have a good grasp on himself. So I guess in a way, for us being able to build a robot is the proof of the pudding. So if we believe that we understood how the human mind works, and we are being able to implement it, then we are also being able to fully understand what it means to be human. And so who's seen the movie Her? Almost hands up, so a wonderful movie, isn't it? I'm usually not much into romantic movies, but this one, or maybe I'm just a nerd. Anyway, so that little thing out there is mobile phone, and this gentleman falls deeply in love with his operating system on his mobile phone. And sometimes I think we're not so far away from that. So I'm traveling these days, 4 weeks already in Europe, and I've seen the most amazing things. I've seen Amsterdam people on the bike, hands off from the steering wheel, and texting through Amsterdam. I have no idea how they do that. Deeply impressed, but also really scared. But sometimes, of course, things can happen very quickly. This was Google's attempt of doing augmented reality. And the interesting thing is, it only took one word to kill it. That's the power of culture. It became socially unacceptable to wear that thing. And of course, we got this big discussion about robots taking away our jobs, and I don't think that's quite a good way of looking at it, because to be very honest, I don't really think that there's much of a difference in what has happened. I mean, for decades and even maybe centuries, we've been busy trying to automate things that we don't like to do ourselves. We're fundamentally lazy. And so the question about job losses is nothing new. I mean, it's been going on since the Industrial Revolution, when made some machines. And so I don't really think that there's anything novel for us to discuss here. It really only ever really becomes interesting, this discussion, when we do not consider robots just to be a machine, but when we start to consider it as being autonomous intelligence that makes decision by itself. Then it adds a component to the discussion that we did not have in the discussion of the machinery with the Industrial Revolution. Now, I would like to share one other nice piece of work that I found from Jordan Wolfston. And this is another robot, and this is a robot you probably haven't seen yet. Who has seen this one before? Oh, it's a handful. Okay, good. So please enjoy this one.
Say feeling love. Just say feeling love. Okay. Feeling love. Okay, now what should I tell them? Tell them touch is love. Say touch is love. Touch is love. Touch is love. Now close your eyes. Now close your eyes.
Would you close your eyes? Yeah. I love this work for many different reasons. And one of them is that he's very playful with this whole idea about pleasure robots and creating a dirty robot. It's just genius. And also, you know, it plays with attraction and repulsion. So there are aspects of this which are attractive and other things which are the opposite. So I think it's a very interesting take on it. And I guess I just had to throw this in there. Oh, come on. Yeah, there we go. We had the first, not the first recorded death by robot. That was already done in the 1980s. But this was the first automotive kill we had recently. And of course, it's very, very sad that this happened. But nevertheless, I think the autonomous cars, I wasn't quite sure if it was autonomous cars or if it would be the killer drones that would kind of really spark the discussion about the ethics of robots making decisions. But it seems right now people are more concerned about autonomous cars than about killer robots. So you might think this is trivial, but it's not. Because, see, if you are serious about the Geneva Convention, it does say that every combatant must be held morally responsible for their actions, right? And if you have a killer drone flying around killing people, and it acts autonomously, so not by joystick, by a human, but it does act autonomously, and we do have these systems already, logically that means we must give them full moral responsibility for their actions, which means they must become moral entities, which means we must give them the status of a moral agent. So, but somehow people these days seem to be less concerned about killing people than about their cars. So right now it really looks more like the car is driving the discussion around it. And I have the pleasure to currently supervise a PhD, co-supervise a PhD student, Sean Welsh, who is doing robot ethics. So actually he should be the one standing here and giving this talk because he's much more qualified, I guess. So the way I work with students is that, you know, quite often towards the end of the PhDs, I do not know anymore or understand what they're doing. And that's perfect because then they exceeded, you know, whatever I knew about. So, and Sean is at that level, which I think is great. But I guess what I learned from my discussions with him is the very naive idea that many people have, not people who work with robots less, but if you talk to the general public, is this belief that, or this mirroring of the human. So they think robots as if they would be humans, as we talked about before. But humans, you know, as you know from the dual process theory, usually have two ways of operating. There's system 1, system 2. The system 1 is intuition, heuristics, you know, quick emotional decisions. And system 2 is this rational thinking. You start thinking about it and you try to calculate the right answer. Now, with robots and also with computers, there is no system one. There is no intuition. There is no moral intuition about what is right and what is wrong. With a computer, with a robot, you have no choice. Well, you've got the choice. You've got two choices. Either you calculate or you throw a dice. And that's all you can ever do. And so we have no other choice but to formalize thinking. We have to formalize ethics. And that will be the only way robots will ever be able to think about ethics. And it doesn't mean that, computing is a wide field. You don't have to find the perfect answer. You can approximate, you can use fuzzy logic. There's all other ways of approximating, thinking. But nevertheless, it has to be done through math. It's the only way, because there is no intuition in a robot other than randomness. So anyway, with these thoughts, I think I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, then please shoot the questions and not me.
Questions? I'm sure others of us will ask questions concerning the last remarks of yours about what computers will ever be able to do and not to do. What I want to ask you about is the following. In an interdisciplinary conference, of course, we need to sort of challenge each other and comment on each other. So I'd like to ask a question that challenges the very concept of anthropomorphization or anthropomorphism that you unfold. And following the work as you have presented it here, I think it is brilliant, impressive, and so on. So I'm a great fan, if you would. The only question that I have is, couldn't there be a all-too-quick conflation of interpreting something as a social agent and interpreting something as a human social agent? We do socialize our world, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily anthropomorphize everything that we socialize. And so the last, one of your last remarks was when you said we need to give these other agents, once they have reached a certain type of level of interaction with us, we need to give them moral status. I think that, for instance, is an inference that does not need to follow. If we operate with a more sophisticated concept of sociality, where we admit artificial forms or asymmetric forms of sociality, I talked about this yesterday, then this inference does not follow. There might well be social agents that we do not give moral status, and we have a couple of examples. I mean, animals, for instance, could be considered that way. Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
That's enough.
Yeah, so animals is a good example, and I think one of our colleagues, his name just escapes me, did exactly that. He looked at essentially what can we learn from animal rights, and how could that lessons we learned be applied to human-robot interaction. And that, I think, is a very valid point. So it's not a binary choice. I think it is indeed a gradient. And we have robots that don't resemble humans. And I think it's actually a very wise choice. So I'm a big fan of the Aibo robot, Sony's dog, because it didn't pretend to be human. And it's all about matching the appearance with its ability. So it had speech recognition in the 90s. It didn't really work. Just like a dog, Perfect. So yes, it is a gradient, and we are currently still so much struggling with the intelligence part of a robot that it's, for experimental reasons, it might be fun to build, a humanoid robot. For practical reasons, it's probably not a good idea, because you just raise expectations you can't hold up. So anthropomorphism does not necessarily mean, so there's a question about human likeness versus life likeness. But we did also another study that I didn't talk about, where we went the other way around. So in the same way that you can actually anthropomorphize things, you can also dehumanize humans. And that has been done many times in our history. I mean, hey, I'm German, I know how to do this, right? You just declare, a certain group of people not to be real humans, and you can do anything you want to them, right? That's the way to go. The Spanish did the same thing when they went to South America. You just call them animals, and you can do whatever you want. So we've done it in the past. I guess to some degree we still do it today. So yes, I agree it's a gradient, and anthropomorphism does not automatically mean human likeness. It can also just mean life likeness, and I think animals having a robotic helper that is more like an animal is probably the better way to go right now. No?
Sorry, the point was simply that we should separate between anthropomorphism and socializing. It's not that anthropomorphism is a gradient, it's sociality that is a gradient. And the highest end of sociality, that is where anthropomorphism comes in. When we accept something as a human socialism, and we can retain a link between as we need in the sensibility to our perceptual schemes and norms of government schemes. We want desperately to try and retain the link between moral status and human beings. And that is something that we should never give up. So, precisely for reasons from the past, we should never give that up. This is a fixed norm that we need to stick to.
Yeah.
And we might experience this phase of morality to animals in terms of moral agency, but not in terms of moral agency, moral status, and moral rights. Or rather, we can derive rights from moral agency.
Yeah.
But the point I wanted to make is, let's separate the concepts. Let's be a little more careful here and say, there is something that you do when you socialize the world.
Yeah. So I at this point, I have to admit incompetence, in the sense that what I learned also, again, with working with Sean, is that definitions, clear definitions of concepts about what we mean by certain things, socializing and things, philosophers are much more ahead of that than I am. So I'm less obsessed with definitions. Maybe I'm a bit more of a Wittgenstein person here, but nevertheless, I agree with you, and I challenge you. I believe that you spend more time touching your phone than touching your partner. And that means something about socializing. Damn it.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of fascinating stuff. I have a question about this hesitation, the method. I was just wondering if there's a kind of too simplistic background assumption there that either something is human, in which case it's not to be destroyed, or it's not human, in which case it can be destroyed without any qualms. And I think that's, of course, any old object is something that is not to be destroyed. We hesitate to break, a mirror or eyeglasses or whatever, which we certainly don't anthropomorphize. So I think that sort of more nuance is needed for when this to get to the distinction between destroying and killing. I think.
Yeah. So in this experiment, all of the participants were well behaved, and we all have respect for property. We all have respect for property of others. Very few of us, go around with a hammer and smash things. It does happen, but fortunately, that's about a small proportion. And in our experiments, all of them checked back. So all of them would say, "Do you really want me to do this?" And they want to get the confirmation that it would be okay to damage the property, right? And so I agree with you, that level is there. And we had to push them over the line of that at all times. We had a set protocol on how much we push them. And if the protocol foresaw that if they 3 times refuse to do it, we would stop. But that never happened. So they all asked once, maybe twice, and then they went for it. So I would still hold up that they went the extra mile and they were aware of what they were doing, that this would go beyond just damaging property, that it was clear to them that this had an impact. And the question about whether in their mind they thought this thing is alive or not is again, for the sake of our experiment, not so less interesting, because again, it's a matter of definitions. I don't think they rationally thought about, oh, this is a lovely thing and this is not a thing. Maybe it's an animal, therefore animal rights apply. They don't do that. They just make the intuitive decision about what feels right, and they felt it was more important to obey the experimenter.
Yes, I like very much all what you said, and I take an example from what you said about killer whales and
sea pandas.
So if instead of calling those devices that people try to destroy, if instead of calling them robots, you call them talking doll, for example, or just a doll, do you think they would react in the same way? But the reason I'm asking the question is that since childhood, parents use doll also to teach their children to be gentle, because dolls resemble humans. So the anthropomorphism issue is really profound in our education. And we use dolls, which are just a piece of plastic or a piece of wood, whatever. The fact of naming something robot appeals to the public imagination.
Yes.
And therefore, it's telling them more than it is, because they are going to have science fiction ideas and so on. And the problem, actually, also raised by Johanna, is that the issue is, with this is that we are, in a way, by doing this, on purpose, confusing people and make them think that robots have an identity or personhood which is similar to a human personhood. Whereas the main question is to ask ourselves, what is human personhood? What does distinguish us from other species or machines?
Well, in this case, I would have to say that I agree with you that what I mentioned before as well, the idea that people have about robots is largely formed through the media. And that's why in this particular study, because barely anybody would have interacted with a robot before, we had this phase where they do actually interact with the actual robot to experience what this robot is and what it does and what it is like. So this phase is important. So if you would just do this by a questionnaire, you send it out asking, would it be okay to smash a robot? You probably get different results. And this is something which I kind of strongly advocate, is that in the study of human-robot interaction, it is essential that you have the person actually being in front of a robot. Not a just questionnaire, not just a video of the robot. You have to be in front of the robot to actually experience it. The question about would have mattered terminology, yes, I think so. I mean, this study was done years back, so my research has progressed. I have learned, or at least I've changed my opinion. In that sense, we have been very careful about the consistent calling of the things. So we called the robot, we called it killing. We made sure that it's consistent. So not that we would once say destroy the robot and another time we would say kill the robot. So the only thing we can claim is consistency. And we didn't lead on the participants anyway. We didn't say, is the robot alive, yes or no? We didn't give them any information. But of course, by using the word kill, we indirectly imply that it is alive, right? Because again, if you give open the opportunity to kill it, means that it must have been alive before. Yes. So terminology is indeed important, and if we would have to redo the experiment, we'd probably be more careful and maybe even investigate whether, after we've done this experiment now with the use of language, it actually informs, it might actually be a good point to redo the other study and see if the change of terminology would have influenced the results. But again, the focus here is not so much on theory and developing the theory about what is the truth of the robot, but very much we're interested in what do people do. So it's more of an empirical approach to things, and so none of the participants would have been able to have an argumentation on the level as Joanna or you would have raised. They wouldn't be able to operate, and even I struggle with it. So
we actually have 3 questions there, and then.
At the end of your talk, you introduced the distinction between System 1 and System 2, and asserted that robots are imprisoned, if you will, in System 2, our System 2, and they can't handle System 1 thinking, intuitive thinking. I think that's odd, because most of what drives AI, in my experience, is the attempt to mathematize intuitive thinking in the human sphere. So I find that I'm just curious as to how that. I'm not sure where that thought comes from. I mean, chess was supposed to be remarkably intuitive in the human sphere, but then we reduced that intuition in chess. Now you could say, well, yes, but we know how humans do it, and it's not how the machine is doing it. But you also told us in your talk that there's a deep mystery as to what the brain is doing. So you can't have it both ways. So if you think it's mysterious on the cognitive neuro side, and all we have is behavior, manifestations of intuitive thinking and intuitive behavior, AI looks at that and says, fine, we'll just figure out how to mechanize that, and specifically how to mathematize it. So could you say more about where you're coming from there? I think this is selfish because in my case it's moral intuition. So I want to take moral intuition from the human sphere and mathematize it and give it to the machine.
yes, exactly. That is exactly the point. You have to put it into math. That's the only way, because that's the only way computers work. Humans, the System 1 is, there are some examples of it, but when humans think in System 1, it is really a very intuitive thing. It's just like the answer pops up and you just say it, right? And you do not, in your mind, use rationality at all. You just feel the right answer without knowing how, right? And that is a very necessary and very old part of our brain that does that. But my point being is that a lot of, let's say, people who do not work in AI, I very often get people in the lab and they look at the robot and they ask me, oh, so what can it do? And then I always have to say, nothing. It can't do nothing, because they assume that, even a robot at least works on the level of intuition of level 1, and it can do something, at least on the intuitive level. And of course they can't. And so it is this kind of misbelief I just want to point out, that robots can only ever do things that we put into their brain, and the only things we can put into their brain is expressed in math. So we have no other choice but to put it into math. Now the question about the black box problem, about, okay, if we do express this in math, is that the same way that the human mind works? And is it necessary for a system, for an AI, to be like a human in order to work like a human? Is a different story. And I'm quite comfortable with a robot not being like a human. I don't think it's necessary for a robot to exactly resemble the functioning of the human mind, as long as it produces the output. So I'm kind of, maybe I'm too much of an engineer. If it works, and I'm happy. It doesn't matter how, as long as it works. So I guess the problem that you pointed out in terms of the black box problem, and also the problem do we understand how the human mind works? And I have some doubts about that. Does not inhibit the progress we make on developing AI.
Just a brief follow-up. Of course, I recognize that the minute you try to write a program, by definition, you're formalizing, mathematizing.
Yes.
So we all know that's a truism about how you work with machines. What I'm saying is, when you don't know what the underlying process is that you're labeling intuitive, you can often reduce it. You can capture what that is in mathematical terms. In the case of Kahneman, for example, with intuitive thinking in economics, it's exactly what prospect theory does. So I think you misunderstood my point. It doesn't remain a mystery when science advances. You figure out what the heck it is under the hood, and then you do indeed reduce it to some kind of formal mechanistic form. And this is why you also said, I think earlier, just give it to the engineers that figure out how to do it. That's how they operate. So I don't think
Yeah.
we get you. Okay, but thank you.
There's one over here with the pen.
Hello, so I'm Sandra Love from the University of Gothenburg, and thank you for a really good talk. And I was thinking in the end of the talk, you talked about the moral responsibility that you took as a safeguarding part and so on. And as a design, if you're someone with a design background, and I was thinking to go back to your title, the title of your talk, How Human Are Robots and How Robots Are Humans. I think there is a bit of problem when you give the moral responsibility to machines. You're at the same time reducing the value of people somehow. And I know, for example, Lucy Sachman has been concerned with this and related to the network theory perspectives and so on, because you kind of reduce the human. And what is your perspective of that, considering the kind of society we want to build and so on? This is like this for people rather than machines.
Yeah, so I think quite often we humans take ourselves too seriously, and that's too important. So I don't personally. So it is this. Actually, we just published a study on this. It's not in the slides yet, but maybe I should. We did a study where we were trying to investigate what exactly is it that makes people feel so uncomfortable about the perspective of a society in which you have robots that are stronger and smarter than you. What's the problem? Why is that so scary? And the scary part is, of course, the media, right? Because all the movies that you see, at that point, they always take over, kill and enslave everybody, right? And that's the story we've been told over and over and over again, and bores them to death. So, I'd be more than happy to make that study available. Well, I can't reproduce it now appropriately, but I'm not so worried about it, because this assumption that being smarter automatically means that you become evil is, I think, silly. I mean, actually, if you're really smart, you probably figure out that being evil is being pretty stupid. So.
Unfortunately, we have to freeze all our other questions with coffee and tea. Thank you again,
Thank you.
Christoph.